Hello everybody and welcome back to my sewing room. If you're new, my name's Diane and I like to share with you the things I've been doing in my quilty world. So if you see the front of this video, you'll see I have called this quilt A Stitch in Time, and I'll talk to you about that in a moment. But it forms part of a series of short videos that I'm calling Spring Clean. So today is the 9th of May, and in the UK where I'm based, meteorological spring ends on the 31st of May. So I'm hoping that I can get all of these little short videos in by that time. And the thing that connects them all is I lost my sewing momentum, my SewJo. I had heard of other people talking about losing their SewJo, and that is just something I never thought that I would ever experience, because I'm really passionate about making quilts, and if I'm not making them, I'm thinking about making them, or I'm looking for fabric to put in them, or watching other people make them and things. But I was hit with the scenario of having a lot less time to spend in my sewing room, and so perhaps that was part of this giving up the quilt. But I did. I really didn't want to make quilts anymore, but I did have a lot of fabric in my room, small pieces that I'd pre-cut and also some yardage. And I remember in the back of my mind when I thought, oh, I don't want to make quilts anymore, was a story I'd once heard of somebody that felt the same way, and she cleared out all of her fabric, gave it away, and then a couple of years down the line she decided she wanted to quilt again. So an expensive lesson learned there, I think. Maybe she just needed to clear the decks and get rid of all the stash and start again. I don't know. I don't know the details of her story. But I felt similarly, but I remembered that story, and I thought what I shall do is I shall give a good clean to my room, and there are smaller pieces of fabric, because if this was a permanent thing and I'm not going to make quilts anymore, then I know there's a place I'll give all the large pieces of fabric to Project Linus, but the smaller pieces, I thought, what can I do with those? There were scraps of bits of fabric everywhere, and I thought I will deal with that first. But I'll explain that at the end of the video. At the beginning of the video, you saw that this quilt was called A Stitch in Time, and I called that I suppose because it was quite a momentous time for me. I thought I don't want to make quilts anymore, but also it was a quilt that I made after a visit to our local Project Linus. So I just dropped off some quilts. There are 4 of them, quite small quilts and a couple of larger ones. And so I dropped those off, and then I received a newsletter from our Project Linus saying that in March of 2025, Project Linus UK had been going for 25 years, and they put a call out to people that were willing to make a Chevron Design Quilt. You could use any method you like, but they asked if you could include a little bit of silver if you had it. Well, I didn't have any silver, but I did have some of this lovely white with Roman numerals on that Estella had given me to make quilts for Project Linus a few months back, and so I thought I will incorporate that. And I came back and thought I could make one of those quilts quite quickly, and I'll make that for Project Linus, and that will use up some of the material I have in my cleanup and de-stashing. So I tend to make a lot of my quilts in half square triangles. I really like half square triangles, and the method I use is to take 2 pieces of fabric right sides together, cut a square 4 3/4 inches, so around the edge, cut on the diagonal, and then you get these half square triangles. Well, I had some strips of fabric already cut in 4 3/4 inches that I'd use for another project. So there's this black with a small dot, then there was this clock that I bought, and then that's on a black background as well, and this lovely tan which I thought really worked well with those clocks, and then the white background with the black Roman numerals. That isn't silver, but I thought that might work. And so I made lots of half square triangles, and then I just put those into rows. So as you can see from this image, it does give the chevron effect. And to be honest, I probably could have made that quilt in my sleep. I was thinking of other things and I just threw it all together, and then I put them on the design board and decided to just align them in a different way just to make it a little bit more impactful. So as you can see, I just step back a little bit, alternated the rows, and I did say that my mind was far away. It wasn't on the quilting. So I pieced it and I put the batting in and the backing, which I had. I bought some from Rainbow Fabrics, which is a dead stock company. You can buy it globally. It's based in the UK. And I thought that would work really well, and put a little border. I'd brought the back to the front. And so I basted it, and then I bound it. I forgot to quilt it. When I say my mind wasn't here, it really wasn't. And I realised that there was no quilting at all anywhere. And if you have ever tried to quilt after you've bound the edges, it's not something I'd recommend. Because the fabric wants to move, even if it's just a little bit, it does. So I was tugging and pulling and cursing. It looks okay, actually. It's come out all right. I did have to do a lot of tugging and pulling, but as my mother used to say, it all came out okay in the wash, which it did. I've washed it all up and there are no wrinkles or creases or anything. I mean, I was really lucky because it could have turned out a lot worse than it did. And here are some images of the self-binding where I've brought the back to the front, and as you can see there are a couple of stitches on the inside and the outside. That's just to make it a little bit more robust. So that was the first quilt finished, and I put a label on the back, ready for Project Linus. When I dropped those other quilts off, I picked up 5 more labels. So my plan was to use up all of the smaller pieces of fabric in Project Linus quilts and to use up those 5 labels. So there would be another 5 quilts leaving my room at least. So that was my plan. But I just didn't want to make a quilt. I wanted to tidy up, which I did, I cleaned, but I really didn't want to design anything or make anything. And so what I thought was I would just use up all the bits of fabric that I already had in my box that I keep for backing. There were smaller chunks in there, and so I just put those together. So I knew I was going to make quilts at some point, I didn't know when, but I knew they would need backing, and I really like a scrappy backing. On the last quilt I made, the Kingfisher quilt, I did put a scrappy back on that. So this first piece of backing, it's not very big, but it was all of the brushed cotton that I had. And then I thought I would put together some of the smaller blocks I'd been making. But I had seen some of these lovely squares within squares. These are all trimmed to 3 inches, these finish at. And some of them, I used to use up all of the small pieces of fabric that I had to make these little squares. And some of them work out really well and look lovely. You know, they've got odd little bits on that I think would brighten up a child's quilt. But some of them, some are nice and some were not so nice. Ugly. So it didn't quite work, but it was still fabric, and you know, fabric is precious. And so I thought I will take out all of the pieces of fabric, these small 3-inch squares within squares that I didn't really like and didn't think, you know, were worthy. I'm being a bit judgmental, to go on the front of a quilt. And so I thought I would put those together and form a backing. And so I'll show you the backing that I made using the not so pretty squares within squares. So as you can see, they're not bad. I had to add a little piece of cream just to square them up into a decent size. I made those 6 inches square. And in my backing scraps, I did have some of that dusky rose colour. I bought that as a new duvet a long time ago, and I used that to border, put a sashing around those little squares, and then I put a bigger border around the outside. And I think that's a good place now to end this week's video. So I had completed the quilt, and then I had used up all of the backing scraps, put those together to make some backing for potential future quilts. And that's where I left it for a while. I closed the door on my sewing room, but then I did return, as you know I would. And I sort of tackled some of the smaller pieces, and I'll show you what happened next in my sprinkling too, and you'll see how I managed to cope with not sewing quilts. Thanks for watching. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you soon. Bye.